The cowboy reached for his shotgun the moment the girl whispered, "Please, don't let him take me." Snow slammed against the cabin walls, while hoofbeats circled outside in the dark. Ruby clutched the front of Levi's coat so tightly, her knuckles burned white. Somewhere beyond the frozen window, a man laughed, and Levi slowly cocked the shotgun beside the fire without taking his eyes off the door. Then someone outside called Ruby's name. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Snow drifted across Black Hollow in long white sheets, blowing between the narrow storefronts and hitching posts like smoke. By noon, the streets had turned to gray slush where wagon wheels cut through the ice. Ruby Mae Carter stood behind the laundry shed beside Miller's boarding house, with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands red from scrubbing shirts in freezing water. Steam rose from the wash barrel. Somewhere beyond the stable, a train whistle echoed low through the valley. Inside the boarding house, men laughed over coffee and cards. Outside, Ruby wrung out another shirt and hung it stiff on the line. The wind snapped the cloth hard enough to sting her fingers. "Ruby!" Her stepfather's voice came rough from the front porch. She closed her eyes for half a second before answering. Earl Carter only sounded that way when whiskey sat heavy in his blood. Ruby stepped around the corner of the house. Earl stood near the gate in an old coat stained dark at the cuff. Beside him waited a tall cowboy with snow dusted across his shoulders and hat brim. Two tired-looking horses stood behind his wagon. The man looked older than most riders passing through town, maybe 30. Broad shoulders, quiet face, gray wool gloves patched at the palms. Levi Boone. Ruby knew the name. Folks in Black Hollow called him poor but dependable, the kind of man who fixed fences alone and kept to himself. Earl pointed toward the back lot. "That strip behind the shed's still good grazing land." Levi frowned. "You said 5 acres. It is 5. It's barely 3. Ruby slowed near the porch steps. Earl noticed her and straightened too quickly. Something tightened in her stomach. Levi reached into his coat and handed Earl folded papers. "That's all I've got. Either take it or don't." Earl grabbed the money fast, too fast. Ruby watched his hands disappear into his coat pocket. Then Earl said it. "Take the girl too. She cooks, cleans, works harder than most men." The world seemed to stop moving. The wind, the horses, even the sounds from the saloon across the road. Ruby stared at him, waiting for the laugh that never came. Levi blinked once. "What?" Earl shrugged like he was talking about furniture. "Debt's debt." Ruby's throat closed. Levi stepped back immediately. "No." Earl's jaw tightened. "You need help at that broken-down ranch of yours." "I asked for land," Levi said. "Not her." Ruby looked at the snow packed beside the porch, anywhere except at them. A wagon rolled up through the slush before another word could be spoken. Harland Pierce climbed down slowly, brushing snow from his long black coat. The silver chain on his vest caught weak winter light. Ruby felt cold all at once. Harland's eyes found her immediately. Not her face. Her, the same way men in town sometimes looked at horses before an auction. "Well," Harland said smoothly. "Looks like Earl finally found a way to settle part of what he owes." Earl swallowed hard. "We already made a deal." Harland ignored him. Girl like her could work off debt quicker elsewhere. Ruby's fingers curled around the edge of her coat. Levi noticed. Harland stepped closer. "If Boone won't take responsibility for her, I can arrange something in Billings by next week." Ruby finally looked up. Levi saw it then. The fear, not loud fear, not tears. The kind that sits still because it already knows screaming won't help. Levi's jaw shifted once beneath the cold. "I'll take her," he said quietly. Ruby stared at him. Harland smiled without warmth. Smart decision. The rest happened too quickly. Earl shoved a small cloth bag into Ruby's hands without meeting her eyes. "You'll be better off there." Inside the bag sat 2 dresses, a comb missing 3 teeth, and her mother's blue handkerchief folded neatly at the bottom. That hurt worst of all. Her mother had packed it. Ruby climbed into Levi's wagon alone. No goodbye, no apology. Just the sound of snow crunching beneath boots and the leather reins tightening in Levi's hands. They left Black Hollow before sunset. The road north curved through frozen cottonwoods and narrow hills where the wind blew harder. Levi kept his eyes ahead. He spoke only once near dusk. "There's a stop house about 6 miles up." Ruby nodded without looking at him. Hours later, they reached a small trading post near the creek crossing. One lantern glowed above the stable door. Inside, the owner offered one room and hot stew. Levi paid for both without discussion. Ruby stood near the staircase afterward, clutching her bag. "Where are you sleeping? The stable's warmer than outside. You paid for the room. You should use it." She waited for him to look at her. He didn't. Instead, he stepped aside and kept his face turned toward the wall while she removed her coat. That small gesture nearly undid her. Later that night, Ruby woke to the sound of wind rattling the shutters. The room was dark except for moonlight reflecting off snow. She crossed quietly to the window. Outside, beneath the porch roof, Levi sat in a chair, with an old shotgun resting across his knees. Snow gathered along his boots and shoulders. Every few minutes he glanced toward the road, guarding the door, making sure nobody came near her while she slept inside warm walls. Ruby stood there a long time with her hand against the cold window glass. No man had ever turned his back to make her feel safe before. Morning came pale and colorless over the Montana hills. Frost covered the wagon wheels outside the trading post. Ruby stepped carefully down the narrow stairs with her small cloth bag in hand. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen below. Levi was already outside harnessing the horses. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat. He looked colder than the air itself. The trading post owner stood near the stable door, sipping coffee from a tin cup. "You ought to come inside and warm up, Boone." Levi shook his head once. "Road's long." Ruby noticed his gloves were stiff with ice. He climbed onto the wagon bench without looking directly at her. "There's biscuits wrapped in paper beside you if you're hungry." That was all. The road north narrowed as they climbed toward Dead Creek Valley. Pine trees crowded the hillsides. Ice glazed the creek crossing silver blue beneath the weak afternoon sun. Ruby kept her hands tucked beneath her shawl. Levi spoke only when necessary. "Road dips sharp ahead. Hold tight here. Horse on the left startles easy. Nothing more." Near dusk, they passed an abandoned mining shack half buried in snow. A wooden sign leaned crooked beside the road. Dead Creek Valley, 3 miles. The ranch appeared just before dark. Ruby expected something rough and filthy after hearing folks in Black Hollow talk about Levi Boone's place. Instead, she saw a small weathered house tucked beneath a rise of hills, smoke curling steady from the chimney. Poor, yes, but cared for. A lantern hung beside the porch. Firewood sat stacked neatly beneath canvas. Even the shovel by the steps had been cleaned and leaned carefully against the rail. One old cattle dog limped from beneath the porch and barked low. "That's Ranger," Levi said. "He growls at everybody." The dog sniffed Ruby's boots once, then sat beside her quietly. Levi seemed surprised by that. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and black coffee. A patched quilt covered the narrow bed against the wall. The kitchen shelves held only a few plates and 2 mason jars full of dried beans. Levi removed his hat slowly. "You can take the room." Ruby blinked. "Where will you sleep?" "Barn loft's dry enough. You don't have to do that." "Yes," he said gently. "I do." The words settled into the room softer than the fire crackling in the stove. Later that evening, Ruby washed at the basin near the kitchen stove while Levi worked outside splitting wood. When she loosened her braid, dark curls fell down her back in soft waves damp from melted snow. The front door opened suddenly. Levi stepped halfway inside carrying logs before freezing in place. His eyes lifted by accident, then immediately dropped. "Sorry," he muttered, turning toward the wall so fast one log slipped from his arms onto the floorboards. Ruby stared at him. Most men would have lingered. Levi grabbed the fallen wood without another glance and disappeared back outside into the cold. For the first time in days, something close to confusion touched her face. At supper, they ate venison stew in near silence while wind rattled the windows. Levi pushed the larger piece of meat into her bowl without comment. Ruby noticed anyway. "You don't have much," she said quietly. "Enough. You barely touched yours. I ate earlier." The lie sat plainly between them. Ruby lowered her eyes to the steam rising from the bowl. After a while, Levi spoke again, still looking at the table. "You don't owe me conversation." Her fingers tightened around the spoon. Nobody had ever said that to her before either. Outside, snow began falling harder. The next morning, Ruby woke before sunrise to a scraping sound outside the door. She opened the curtains slightly and found Levi shoveling snow from the porch steps, while Ranger circled beside him. The sky still looked black-blue with dawn, barely touching the mountains. By breakfast, he had already hauled water, fed the horses, and repaired one loose hinge on the chicken coop. Ruby watched quietly while he poured coffee into a chipped tin cup. His hands looked rough enough to split wood bare, yet every movement stayed careful. That afternoon, Ranger stole one of Levi's gloves and ran circles around the yard with it hanging from his mouth. Levi cursed under his breath while chasing the old dog through knee-deep snow. Ruby laughed before she could stop herself. The sound startled both of them. Levi stopped running. Ranger stopped too. For one strange second, the whole yard went still. Then Levi smiled, only a little, but enough to soften his face completely. Ruby looked away first. Later that evening, she carried folded laundry toward the back room when voices drifted through the cracked barn door outside. She paused. "Can't keep paying interest forever," a man said. Levi answered low and tired. "I know. You sell the north field, you might clear half." Silence followed. Then Levi said quietly, "That land's all I got left." Ruby stood frozen behind the door, the cold creeping through her boots. So even this place wasn't safe from debt. Even this man carried chains she couldn't see. By nightfall, the wind changed. The horses grew restless in the corral. Ranger paced near the porch, whining low in his throat. Levi stepped outside and stared toward the northern mountains. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks, thick as smoke. Ruby joined him near the porch rail, pulling her coat tighter. "What is it?" she asked softly. Levi didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Storm's coming hard." Far off across the valley, thunder rumbled beneath the snow-heavy sky. And down near the lower pasture, the horses were still outside the fence. Levi grabbed his coat from the nail beside the door. "Stay inside," he said. The wind hit the cabin hard enough to shake the windows. Ruby stepped onto the porch after him anyway. Snow swirled across the yard in sharp white streaks. Down near the lower field, dark shapes moved restlessly against the fence line. "You can't bring them in alone," she said. Levi looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he pulled his gloves tighter and handed her the lantern. "Keep close to the fence. Don't wander if the snow gets thick." By the time they reached the pasture gate, the storm had fully arrived. The horses screamed against the wind. One slammed sideways into the broken rail while another reared hard enough to snap its lead rope. Snow stung Ruby's cheeks like thrown sand. Levi fought the gate open with both hands. "Move!" he shouted over the storm. Ruby waved the lantern low, guiding the horses toward the barn. Ranger barked wildly beside them, darting at the animals' heels. Then the wind changed. A loud crack split through the dark. Ruby turned just in time to see the upper gate beam break loose. "Levi!" The heavy timber slammed into his shoulder and threw him hard against the fence post. For one awful second, he disappeared beneath blowing snow. Ruby dropped the lantern into the drift and ran. "Levi!" He pushed himself halfway upright with a groan, one arm hanging wrong at his side. "I'm fine," he gritted out. He wasn't. Ruby grabbed his coat and dragged with everything she had while the storm howled around them. By the time they stumbled into the barn, Levi's face had gone pale beneath the cold. Inside the cabin, the fire had nearly died. Ruby shoved more wood into the stove until sparks burst up the chimney. Levi sat heavily near the table, jaw tight, snow melting down the collar of his coat. "Let me see it." "It's nothing, Levi." Something in her voice made him stop arguing. He peeled the coat back slowly. The shoulder beneath his shirt was dark purple already, swelling near the collarbone. Ruby fetched the sewing basket from the shelf beside the stove. Her hands shook while threading the needle. Levi watched quietly from the chair. "You learned that at the boarding house?" he asked. She nodded once. "Folks tear things more often than they mend them." The corner of his mouth moved slightly at that. Outside, wind battered the roof in heavy waves. Ruby stitched the ripped seam near his shoulder carefully while Levi held still. Once, when the needle slipped against his skin, she whispered, "Sorry, it's all right." Neither looked up. Hours later, the storm worsened. Snow packed against the windows until the glass turned white. The last of the dry wood burned low in the stove. Ruby broke apart an old kitchen chair for kindling. Levi noticed immediately. "Don't you'd rather freeze?" That chair was still good. She tossed another broken piece into the fire anyway. Warm light flickered across the cabin walls. Ranger slept near the stove with his nose tucked beneath his tail. Near midnight, Levi's fever climbed. Ruby soaked cloth in warm water and pressed it gently against his neck while he drifted in and out of sleep beneath the blanket. At one point, he muttered something she couldn't understand. Then clearer. "Emily, keep your shoes on. Snow's too deep." Ruby looked at him quietly. Another long silence passed before he whispered, almost like a child, "I couldn't get her warm enough." The words stayed hanging in the firelight. Ruby finally understood why loneliness sat on him like an old coat he couldn't take off. Toward dawn, a new sound reached the cabin. Horse hooves. Levi's eyes opened instantly. 3 riders appeared outside. Through the storm haze, Harland Pierce stepped onto the porch with snow gathered on his shoulders and 2 men behind him carrying rifles. Ruby's stomach tightened so fast it hurt. Harland held up folded papers near the window. Earl Carter signed transfer rights before Boone ever touched the deal. Levi rose slowly despite the pain in his shoulder. "You should leave," he said. Harland smiled thinly. "Girl comes with me tonight, and maybe I forget part of what you owe." Ruby's fingers locked around Levi's sleeve. He felt it. Levi reached for the old shotgun resting beside the stove and stepped in front of the door. The cabin suddenly seemed very small, very quiet. "You can take the horses," Levi said. Wind rattled the walls. "You can take the land." Harland's expression darkened. "But you don't take her." Ruby stared at the back of him standing there between her and the storm. Nobody had ever chosen her over anything before. Not money, not fear, not convenience. Harland held Levi's gaze another long second before finally spitting into the snow. "This debt's still breathing, Boone." Then he turned away into the blizzard. The riders vanished slowly into white darkness. Inside the cabin, silence returned inch by inch. Levi lowered the shotgun carefully. Ruby still hadn't let go of his coat. He glanced down at her hand but said nothing. Later, when the fire burned lower and the cold crept back into the room, they spread blankets beside the stove instead of wasting heat on separate corners. Levi stayed on his side facing the wall. Even then he kept distance between them. Ruby watched the fire for a long while before quietly placing her hand against his injured shoulder, just for a second. Levi went still beneath her touch. Neither of them spoke. By morning the storm had finally passed. The valley lay buried beneath deep, untouched snow, shining blue beneath weak sunlight. Ruby stepped outside, carrying water for the horses. Then she stopped. Down near the road, Levi stood beside a trader's wagon, holding the reins of his black gelding, the finest horse on the ranch. Ruby watched Levi hand the reins over without argument. The trader counted coins into his palm, while Levi kept his eyes on the snow. Only then did Ruby understand. He was selling the horse to pay Harland Pierce. The black gelding had been the finest thing on the ranch. Strong shoulders, fast legs, smart eyes that followed Levi everywhere he walked. Ruby had seen Levi brush that horse down after supper, even when his own hands shook from cold now. The animal disappeared down the snowy road behind another man's wagon. Levi stood alone near the fence line with silver coins folded into his palm. He looked smaller somehow, not weak, just tired in a place deeper than bone. Ruby carried the water bucket slowly toward the barn without speaking. She knew pride when she saw it, knew the shape of a wound a person tried to hide. That night, Levi counted the money at the kitchen table, beneath the oil lamp. Receipts from the feed store and the trading post sat stacked beside his elbow. Ruby stitched quietly near the stove. "You didn't have to sell him," she said at last. Levi kept his eyes on the papers. "Needed paying." For me, for the debt, those were not the same thing, though neither of them said it aloud. Winter loosened its grip inch by inch after that storm. Snow melted from the lower hills first. Mud swallowed wagon wheels along the road into town. By early March, water dripped steadily from the cabin roof every afternoon. Ruby stayed, not because Levi asked, because leaving slowly stopped feeling possible. In the mornings, she swept the porch while Levi repaired storm damage along the fence. Ranger followed her everywhere now, limping faithfully behind her skirts, with one ear twitching whenever she spoke. Some afternoons, children from nearby homesteads wandered past the ranch, carrying torn spelling books. Ruby helped them sound out words beside the porch steps while soup simmered inside. Levi never interrupted, but sometimes she caught him watching quietly from the barn doorway. Once Clara Whitmore stopped by with dried herbs and a basket of eggs balanced beneath her arm. "You've got color back in your face," the old woman told Ruby while they sorted mint leaves across the kitchen table. Ruby smiled faintly. "Maybe the mountain air," Clara snorted. "Maybe the cowboy." From outside came the steady rhythm of Levi's hammer striking wood. Ruby lowered her eyes too quickly. By April, green pushed through the thawed ground near Dead Creek. One evening, Levi came inside carrying fence wire over his shoulder. Mud streaked his jeans to the knees. Ruby noticed a tear along the seam of his shirt near the elbow. "Hold still," she said. Levi stopped halfway to the wash basin. She threaded a needle beneath the lamp while he stood awkwardly beside the table, like a man uncertain where to place his hands. Ruby stitched the torn fabric carefully. Levi watched her fingers moving through the cloth. "You don't gotta do that." "I know." The answer settled softly between them. When she finished, her hand brushed his forearm by accident. Levi's breath caught almost too quietly to hear. Neither moved right away. Then Ranger barked outside, and the moment broke apart like thin ice under boots. A week later, Ruby rode into town alone with Clara for flour and lamp oil. The general store fell silent when she walked inside. Two men near the stove exchanged glances. "That Boone girl," one muttered low enough to pretend he hadn't meant her to hear. "Bought cheaper than cattle, from what I heard." Ruby's fingers tightened around the flour sack. She left the store without finishing the order. Outside, rain clouds hung low over Black Hollow. Mud clung heavy to her boots while Clara loaded supplies into the wagon. "You don't listen to fools," Clara said sharply. Ruby stared down the road toward Dead Creek, but the words stayed. That night she sat awake long after Levi fell asleep in the chair near the stove. The lamp burned low beside him. One boot still rested half unlaced against the floorboards. He looked exhausted, older somehow in sleep. Ruby watched the rise and fall of his breathing and thought about the sold horse, the debt, the whispers in town. Maybe Harland Pierce had been right. Maybe she was ruining everything she touched. Near dawn, she folded her mother's blue handkerchief carefully into her coat pocket. Then she packed her small cloth bag again. Ranger lifted his head as she opened the cabin door. "Shh!" Ruby whispered softly, kneeling beside him. Don't wake him. The old dog whined low in his throat anyway. Ruby stepped outside into cold spring rain. She walked south before sunrise, following the abandoned rail path through soaked grass and muddy stone. By noon, she reached an empty line shack near the old tracks west of Bitter Pass. Inside smelled of wet wood and rust. Ruby sat on the narrow bench beneath the broken window and pulled her coat tighter around herself. For a long while there was only rain tapping against the roof. Then came hoofbeats, fast, desperate. The cabin door burst open hard enough to rattle the hinges. Levi stood there, soaked through to the skin, chest heaving from the ride. Rainwater dripped from his hat brim onto the warped floorboards. For 1 second, neither of them spoke. Then Levi crossed the room in 3 strides. You left. Ruby looked away first. Harlan's coming after the ranch because of me. That's not your fault. You sold your horse. I'd sell the whole place before handing you over to him. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Ruby's eyes burned suddenly. You don't understand. People talk. They think I know what they think. Levi's voice stayed low, steady. That don't make them right. Rain hammered the roof harder. Ruby pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. I didn't want to destroy your life. Levi stared at her a long moment. Then he removed his wet gloves slowly and dropped them onto the table. This place stopped feeling empty when you walked into it, he said. The room went still. Even the rain seemed farther away, somehow. Ruby looked at him then, really looked. At the exhaustion beneath his eyes. The mud splashed up his coat from riding hard through the storm. The fear he hadn't bothered hiding. Levi stepped closer carefully, like he was approaching something wounded. Stay because you want to, he said quietly. His voice roughened at the edges. Not because the world traded you to me. Then, before Ruby could answer, Levi lowered himself slowly onto one knee against the cold cabin floor. Rain tapped softly against the roof above them. Ruby stared at him in silence, her breath uneven in the small room. Levi looked exhausted. Wet hair clung to his forehead. Mud darkened the knees of his jeans from riding through the storm to find her. Still he stayed there, not demanding, not asking for anything except truth. Ruby swallowed hard. Levi, his eyes lifted to hers at last, gray, steady, frightened in a way she had never seen before. You can leave if that's what you want, he said quietly. But don't leave thinking you're some burden I'm trying to carry. The old cabin creaked in the wind. Ruby thought about Black Hollow, about Earl's whiskey breath, about Harlan Pierce smiling like people belonged on ledgers beside cattle and land. Then she looked at Levi Boone, kneeling on a splintered floor in the middle of nowhere because he couldn't bear losing her. Something inside her gave way. Ruby crossed the small distance between them and touched his face carefully with one trembling hand. Levi closed his eyes for half a second. That tiny reaction nearly broke her heart. I'm tired of running, she whispered. When Levi stood, he moved slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. Outside, thunder rolled farther away across the mountains. By the time they returned to Dead Creek the next morning, clouds had begun to break apart over the valley. Thin strips of sunlight touched the hills in pale gold, but trouble was already waiting at the ranch. Harlan Pierce sat on horseback beside the fence with 2 men behind him. Papers rested in his gloved hand. Ranger barked sharply the moment the wagon stopped. Harlan smiled without humor. Morning, Boone. Levi stepped down first. What now? Treasury notice. Harlan unfolded the papers slowly. You failed payment terms. Ranch can be seized by week's end. Ruby felt cold despite the sunlight. Levi took the papers without a word. Harlan's gaze drifted toward Ruby. You should have come willingly when you had the chance. Would have saved him trouble. Levi's shoulders tightened instantly. Before he could answer, another wagon rolled into the yard from the south road. Clara Whitmore climbed down, holding a leather satchel against her hip. That'll be enough from you, she snapped. Harlan frowned. This don't concern. It concerns me plenty. Clara marched straight past him toward Levi and handed over several folded documents tied with faded blue ribbon. Ruby saw Levi's expression change immediately. "What is this?" he asked. "Your father's original land certificate," Clara said. "The one your mama asked me to keep safe years ago." Harlan's face hardened. Clara looked directly at him then. Funny thing about forged debt records. They don't hold up too well once real paperwork appears. For the first time since Ruby had known him, Harland Pierce looked uncertain. An hour later, a federal marshal, passing through the territory, stopped at the ranch after hearing the dispute from townsfolk down the road. The man examined both sets of papers carefully beneath the porch light while everyone waited in silence. Wind moved softly through the wet grass. Finally, the marshal folded Harlan's documents shut. "These numbers were altered," he said flatly. "Interest markings don't match county records." Harlan's jaw tightened. "That's nonsense." "Maybe," the marshal replied. "You can explain it in Helena." The silence afterward felt enormous. Harland climbed back onto his horse without another word. Mud splashed beneath the hooves as he turned down the road and disappeared beyond the hills. Just like that. Gone. Ruby stood very still beside the porch rail. Levi looked at her carefully. "It's over." The words didn't feel real yet. 2 days later, Ruby rode alone back to Black Hollow. The town looked smaller somehow, dirtier, sadder. Earl Carter sat outside the boarding house, wrapped in an old coat with a whiskey bottle beside his boot. He looked up slowly when Ruby approached. For once, he had nothing sharp to say. Ruby reached into her pocket and placed her mother's blue handkerchief gently on the porch beside him. "You lost me long before that winter," she said. Earl stared down at the cloth without speaking. Ruby turned away before he could answer, and this time she left Black Hollow without carrying shame behind her. A year later, spring settled warm across Dead Creek Valley. Fence posts stood straight again. Horses moved across green pasture beneath open Wyoming sky. Chickens scratched beside the rebuilt coop while Ranger slept in the shade with one cloudy eye half open. Inside the cabin, children's voices echoed around the kitchen table, while Ruby helped them sound out words from worn readers and newspaper scraps. Levi built another room beside the house that summer. Small, simple, strong enough to last winters. One evening near sunset, Ruby stepped onto the porch and found Levi sanding a small wooden box with careful hands. "What's that?" she asked. Levi looked almost embarrassed. Nothing finished yet. But later, after supper, he handed her the box anyway. Inside rested a silver ring shaped by hand. Not perfect. One side curved slightly uneven. Ruby touched it gently like something fragile. Levi rubbed the back of his neck. Blacksmith in Miles City helped with the silver. The wind moved softly through the grass around them. Ranger sighed at their feet. Levi slid the ring onto her finger beneath the fading gold light. No crowd, no music, just the quiet creak of the porch swing and the smell of fresh earth after rain. Ruby looked out across the fields, where Levi had already begun repairing another stretch of fence before tomorrow's work. And standing there beside the man who never once tried to own her, she finally understood something simple. Some people don't save you with grand promises. They save you by staying. And maybe that's the part that lingers after stories like this one end. Not the storms, not the debts, not even the heartbreak. It's the quiet moments. A lantern left burning in the window. Boots waiting by the door. Someone choosing, day after day, not to walk away from you. If you were standing where Ruby once stood, cold, exhausted, carrying all the hurt someone else placed on your shoulders, would you still believe a gentle life was possible for you? Would you trust the hand reaching for yours after everything you'd survived? Out on those wide Wyoming plains, love didn't arrive dressed like a fairy tale. It came slowly, through patience, through respect, through a man fixing fences before sunrise, and a woman learning she no longer had to earn the right to stay. Maybe that's what healing really looks like sometimes. Not loud, not perfect, just steady. If this story stayed with you tonight, leave a simple still here in the comments. I'd love to know who walked this road beside Ruby and Levi until the very end. And if these kinds of quiet Western stories bring you comfort after a long day, you're welcome to stay a while. There are still more dusty roads, old ranches, lost souls, and healing hearts waiting in the next story.